45 days. That is how long it lasted. On the 13th of June, a shopping mall in Kumamoto Prefecture in southern Japan held a reopening ceremony. Aeon Mall Kumamoto had been wrecked in the earthquakes of 2016, closed for months, and then rebuilt over years into something better than it was. 200 stores and businesses, a cinema, parking for 5,000 cars. When it went through its redevelopment, the operator pointed to seismically reinforced ceilings and upgraded safety systems, and when it reopened this June, it did so under a banner that called the moment a restart, marking 10 years since the region began climbing out of the rubble. 45 days later, at 27 minutes past 4 in the afternoon on the 28th of July, the ground beneath Kumamoto snapped sideways. About an hour after the shaking stopped, an explosion tore through that mall and brought a large section of it down onto itself. Aeon's president confirmed employees had been killed. Police could not immediately send rescue teams into the structure because the aftershocks made the building too dangerous to enter. And then, at 10 minutes past 4 this morning, while crews were still working that site and while the death toll was still being revised upward, the sea on the other side of the island moved as well. That is where we start today, because what happened off the coast of Miyazaki before dawn is small on its own, and it matters enormously in context, and by the end of the next 20 minutes, you are going to understand exactly why those two statements are both true. You are also going to understand something about the Pacific Northwest of the United States that most people living there have never been told, and which we only know because of a piece of paper written in Japan more than 3 centuries ago. Here is what came in this morning. At 10 minutes past 4, local time, a magnitude 5.2 earthquake occurred in the Philippine Sea, about 48 kilometers east-southeast of the town of Tsuno, off Japan's Miyazaki coast. That is roughly 30 miles offshore. The depth was 26 kilometers, which is shallow for that part of the world. People near the epicenter reported feeling it. In Miyazaki City itself, a place of more than 400,000 residents about 56 kilometers west of the epicenter, the shaking was light. In Tokyo, 820 kilometers away, nobody felt anything at all. No damage, no tsunami, no warnings. And I want to be blunt about that up front, because this channel does not exist to make your morning worse than it needs to be. If you are watching from Kyushu, this one was not the thing you were bracing for. If you want the honest version of what the planet is doing rather than the loudest version, that is the whole idea behind this channel. And subscribing takes you 2 seconds and keeps you in the loop as this Japanese sequence develops over the coming days. So why open a video with a magnitude 5? Because of where it happened. That patch of water off Miyazaki has a name that makes Japanese seismologists sit up straighter. It is called the Hyuganada Sea, and it sits at the southwestern end of the Nankai Trough, the undersea boundary where the Philippine Sea plate slides down and underneath the plate that Japan is built on. The trough runs roughly 500 miles, from those waters off Kyushu all the way northeast to Suruga Bay in central Japan. Along that line, roughly every 100 to 150 years, the plates lock, strain, and then let go in an earthquake between magnitude 8 and magnitude 9. The last two were the Tectonic quake of 1944 and the Nankai quake of 1946. That second one was a magnitude 8.0, and it killed more than 1,300 people. That was 80 years ago. The Japanese government's Earthquake Research Committee has spent years putting a number on what comes next, and the number they landed on became one of the most quoted statistics in the country. 70 to 80% chance of a magnitude 8 to 9 event along the Nankai Trough within 30 years. In a report issued in late 2025, that same committee widened the range rather than narrowing it, saying the honest span was somewhere between 60% and 94.5% or higher after re-examining old ground uplift measurements from a port in Kochi Prefecture. The head of the panel, Naoshi Hirata of the University of Tokyo, said plainly that an earthquake is an unpredictable natural phenomenon and that they cannot say when it will happen. Now hold that thought, because the Hyuganada Sea has already done something historic once, and it did it recently. On the 8th of August, 2024, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck that same stretch of water. Shaking on land was moderate to strong, reaching about 35% of the force of gravity in places, which is to say the ground was being shoved sideways with roughly a third of the strength that is holding you in your chair right now. A half-meter tsunami was recorded. Stone lanterns toppled at a shrine in Nichinan. Nobody died. And then the Japan Meteorological Agency did something it had never done before. Its expert panel met, looked at where that quake sat relative to the megathrust, and issued the country's first ever megaquake advisory, warning that the chance of a Nankai Trough event had become higher than usual. 707 local administrations across 29 prefectures were covered. Bullet trains slowed down along coastal sections. Beaches closed. People emptied supermarket shelves of bottled water and emergency rations in the middle of a brutal summer. The Prime Minister canceled a foreign trip. 1 week later, on the 15th of August, the government lifted it. No abnormalities had been observed. Life went back to normal, and a lot of people were left wondering what they had just been told. That is the backdrop against which a magnitude 5.2 arrives in the Hyuganada Sea at 4 in the morning. On its own, it is one of the roughly 2,300 earthquakes that happen near Miyazaki every year. In the past 7 days alone, that region logged 3 quakes of magnitude 5 or above. This is normal there in a way that is hard for most of us to imagine. But normal is not the same as meaningless, and it is definitely not the same as calm because of what happened 5 days ago and 150 kilometers to the northwest. The 28th of July, 27 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, a Tuesday, with the school day ending and the shopping centers full, the Japan Meteorological Agency measured a magnitude 7.1. The United States Geological Survey, using a different method, measured the same event at moment magnitude 6.8, with the epicenter 5 kilometers east of the city of Uto. Both numbers describe one earthquake. Neither agency is wrong. That gap between them is going to matter later. What mattered instantly was the depth, roughly 10 kilometers, 6 miles, shallower than the distance a lot of you drive to get to work. And it was not a subduction event out at sea. It was a strike-slip rupture in the crust directly beneath central Kyushu, in the fault network that includes the Futagawa and Hinagu zones, the same tangle of faults that tore the region apart a decade ago. In Uki City and Hikawa Town, the shaking reached Shindo 7. That is the top of Japan's seismic intensity scale, and it does not measure the earthquake. It measures what the earthquake did to the place where you were standing. At Shindo 7, you cannot stand up. You cannot crawl in the direction you want to go. Furniture that was bolted down comes loose and moves across the room. Buildings that were not reinforced do not survive it. One local broadcaster reported that the shaking measured in Toyono, in Uki City, exceeded what that same neighborhood recorded in 2016. A tsunami advisory went out for the Ariake and Yatsushiro seas, warning of waves between 20 centimeters and 1 meter. It was lifted about 100 minutes later. That part of the story ended quietly. The rest did not. As of 7:30 on the morning of the 1st of August, Kumamoto Prefecture's disaster response headquarters had confirmed 36 people dead. Japan's Fire and Disaster Management Agency had counted at least 123 injured. More than 267,000 residents were under evacuation orders, with emergency safety measures covering tens of thousands more households on top of that. To put that number in a shape you can hold, imagine emptying a city the size of Buffalo, New York, or filling a large football stadium 3 times over and telling every single person in it not to go home. Nearly 35,000 homes lost electricity. Around 15,000 lost running water. More than 8,800 people moved into over 400 shelters, where crews were racing to install power sources for one reason above all others: air conditioning. Because while this was happening, the forecast for Kumamoto called for 34 degrees Celsius, 93 Fahrenheit, climbing toward the upper 30s later in the week. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi told the country to take precautions against heat stroke and to understand why that sounds strange coming from an earthquake briefing. Remember that in a shelter with no power in a Japanese summer, the earthquake is not what puts an 80-year-old in the hospital. One hospital in Uki City could not function at all because the power was gone. Another suspended admissions after taking in 86 injured people. Passengers on high-speed trains were hurt when the shaking hit. At the Nippon Paper Industries mill in Yatsushiro, a chimney came down. And at the Aeon Mall in Kashima, roughly 3,000 customers had already been evacuated to the parking lot when, about an hour after the quake, the explosion happened in another part of the building where staff were still inside. That detail is the one I keep going back to. A rebuilt mall, reopened under the language of resilience, and the thing that killed people there was not the shaking. It was what came after the shaking, in a building that had been emptied of shoppers but not of workers. Rescue crews pulled 98 people out and moved 620 more to safety. 9 prefectures sent emergency firefighting teams. Combined local and national forces came to about 1,400 personnel, and the self-defense forces went from about 3,600 deployed to roughly 4,600 within a day. The government stood up a response office at the Prime Minister's office within 1 minute of the quake and a full disaster management headquarters by 20 past 6 that evening. Then came the ground itself, which is where this stops being a news report and starts being geology you can measure. The Geospatial Information Authority of Japan checks its survey markers after events like this, and the numbers came back permanent. A reference point in Yatsushiro had shifted 84 centimeters to the northeast. That is a long stride, and it did not spring back. Another station in Kumamoto moved 40 centimeters north. Slip reached the surface along the Hinagu Fault, cracking open roads and bridges and the foundations of buildings sitting on top of it. 259 aftershocks were recorded. By midday on the 29th, 48 of them had been strong enough to be felt at Shindo 3 or above, including 3 at Shindo 5 lower. The agency's warning was explicit and it was uncomfortable. For 2 to 3 days, expect that another quake with intensity as high as Shindo 7 could happen and stay out of buildings, the first one weakened. Stay alert for a week. They had good reason to say it exactly that way. In April of 2016, this same region was hit by a magnitude 6.5 and people treated it as the main event. About 28 hours later, a magnitude 7.3 arrived on the same fault system, and the second one was the killer. By the time that sequence finished, 277 people were dead and around 2,800 were injured. Before we go further, let me close the loop I left open earlier, because it is the kind of loose thread that breeds nonsense in comment sections. Some outlets reported this earthquake as a 7.1. Others reported it as a 6.8. Neither one is a cover-up, and neither one is a correction. The Japan Meteorological Agency calculates its own magnitude from the size of the ground displacement recorded on its dense national network. It is built for speed because in Japan the whole point is to get a number out while the waves are still traveling. The United States Geological Survey publishes moment magnitude, which is derived from the physics of the rupture itself. The area of fault that broke multiplied by how far it slipped multiplied by the stiffness of the rock. That takes longer to compute, and it is calculated from a different vantage point on the other side of the ocean. 2 methods, 2 agencies, 1 earthquake. The gap still matters though, and here is why. The magnitude scale is logarithmic, so every whole step up is roughly 32 times more energy released. A difference of 0.3 between 7.1 and 6.8 is not rounding. It is close to 3 times the energy. That is how steep this scale is, and it is the single most misunderstood thing about earthquake reporting. And here is the part that should reframe the whole conversation. Neither of those numbers is what decided who lived. Magnitude describes the rupture. Shindo 7 describes the room you were standing in. A moderate quake directly under a town will always do more harm than a huge one far out to sea, and Kumamoto is the proof. So here is the question that has been sitting in the comments of every earthquake video for the past week, and I am going to answer it with data instead of vibes. Is all of this connected? Because it is not only Japan. Look at the last 48 hours around the Pacific Rim. A magnitude 4.3 near Orosi, Costa Rica. A magnitude 4.7 in western China. Two magnitude 5.1 events within 2 minutes of each other in eastern Indonesia, northeast of Masohi. A magnitude 4.5 in the Philippines. And then Japan, twice over, at both ends of 1 week. Laid out like that, it reads like the planet is doing something. It is not. Those events are separated by 6,000 miles and by entirely different plate boundaries, and no known physical mechanism transmits stress between a fault in Costa Rica and a fault in Kyushu. What you are looking at is the base rate. Earth produces well over 1,000 earthquakes of magnitude 5 or above every year, and tens of thousands above magnitude 4. On an average day, the Ring of Fire lights up in several places, and you never hear about it because none of them landed on a town. Run the two Japanese events through that logarithmic scale and the contrast gets stark. Last Tuesday's 7.1 released somewhere in the region of 700 times the energy of the 5.2 that arrived off Miyazaki this morning. 700. That is the difference between a national emergency with the self-defense forces deployed and a line item on a monitoring website that most of Kyushu slept through. So the honest framing of the last 48 hours is not that the Ring of Fire is lighting up. It is that the Ring of Fire is always lit. And last week, one of the sparks landed on a city of 700,000 people instead of on open water. That is the real difference between the 28th of July and this morning. Not the amount of energy, the address. And the connection that does exist is the one worth understanding. Kumamoto and Miyazaki are both on Kyushu, but they are not the same system. Kumamoto was a shallow inland crustal fault, ripping sideways under a populated plain. This morning's quake was offshore, deeper, in the zone where one plate is diving beneath another. Different machine, different failure mode, and no evidence at this point that one triggered the other. Anyone telling you the sea off Miyazaki moved because Kumamoto moved is selling you certainty that the science has not produced. While we are here, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever been in an earthquake? Not felt a rumble on the news, but the real thing, the moment where the floor stops being reliable. Where were you? And what did you notice first? I read those, and the answers are always stranger than what makes it into the reports. Now, why does Japan get so much of this? Because of an accident of geography that has no equal on Earth, most seismic countries sit on one plate boundary. Japan sits at a junction where several major plates converge, with the Pacific plate driving in from the east and the Philippine Sea plate pushing in from the south. The archipelago itself is the crumpled result. Underneath the country runs the median tectonic line, Japan's longest fault system, and at its southern end in Kyushu, that system forks into a spread of active faults through the Beppu Shimabara Graben, a zone that is slowly pulling apart even while everything around it is being squeezed. Kumamoto sits inside that fork. That is why a country famous for offshore megathrust earthquakes keeps getting killed by shallow inland ones instead. The result is a nation where the meteorological agency logs more than 1,500 felt earthquakes in a typical year. Not detected, felt, 4 a day, somewhere, by somebody. And that constant grinding produced something no other country has. A society that has been stress tested over and over until preparation stopped being a policy and became a reflex. Building codes rewritten after every major disaster. Base isolation systems that let towers float on rubber bearings while the ground moves underneath them. Nationwide early warning that reaches phones before the strong shaking arrives. drills in every school, emergency stockpiles that people restock without being told. So here is the calibration that I think matters most, and it cuts both ways. Japan is the most earthquake-ready country on the planet, and 36 people still died last Tuesday. Preparation is not immunity. What preparation does is change the number, and it changes it dramatically. Consider that the shaking recorded off Miyazaki in 2024 at about a third of the force of gravity was strong enough to cause significant damage in a country with weaker construction, and it killed nobody in Japan. Consider that in 2025, a magnitude 7.7 earthquake in Myanmar killed at least 5,400 people, and the true toll is believed to be higher. Similar energy release. Completely different outcome, decided almost entirely by what the buildings were made of and whether anyone had rehearsed. That is the lesson Japan keeps paying tuition for. And it is a lesson with a specific address on the other side of the Pacific. Which brings me to the part I promised at the start, and the strangest fact in this entire story. Off the coast of Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, roughly 70 to 100 miles offshore, runs a fault about 1,000 kilometers long called the Cascadia Subduction Zone. It is the only fault in the continental United States capable of producing a magnitude 9. It has not produced a significant earthquake in the entire written history of the United States. For a long time, nobody was certain it was dangerous at all because there was no record of it ever going off. Then researchers pieced together an answer from ghost forests, buried tidal marshes, and offshore sediment layers, and they found evidence of a massive rupture around the year 1700. But they could not date it precisely, not until someone looked at Japan. Because on the 26th of January, 1700, a tsunami came ashore along the Japanese coast, damaging villages and flooding fields, and it was recorded in local documents with dates and times, and no earthquake had been felt in Japan beforehand. For centuries, it sat in the archives as an oddity, a wave with no parent, and it is now known as the orphan tsunami. It was not an orphan. Its parent was Cascadia, 10.5 hours and 1 ocean away. Sit with the shape of that for a moment. The only reason the United States knows the exact date its most dangerous fault last ruptured is that Japanese villagers 326 years ago wrote down the day the sea came in. So what does Cascadia look like now? The United States Geological Survey puts the chance of a magnitude 9 event on the full zone at roughly 10 to 15% in the next 50 years, with a higher figure around 30% for a magnitude 8 or above along the southern section. The average interval between full ruptures runs about 500 years, though the real spacing has swung from 200 years to more than 800. 326 years have passed since 1700. That is why you hear the word overdue, and that word is loose language for a process that has never kept a schedule. It is not a countdown clock. It is a coin that has been sitting on the table for 3 centuries. What it would do is not vague at all. Federal planners work from scenarios with several minutes of shaking, followed by a tsunami reaching parts of the outer coast within 15 to 30 minutes, with waves that could run up to around 100 feet in the worst exposed inlets, taller than a 10-story building. FEMA's planning estimate for a magnitude 9 puts the death toll in Oregon and Washington in the range of 14,000, with more than 8 million people inside the projected damage zone, and coastal communities cut off from road access for around 2 weeks. 2 weeks. That is the number that should stick. Not the magnitude, not the wave height, the 2 weeks in which no truck reaches you, and that number is the one you can do something about, which is more than can be said for the fault. 2 weeks of water works out to about 14 gallons per person, and it is the single least glamorous and most useful thing in any emergency plan. Shoes and a flashlight under the bed, because broken glass in the dark is what sends people to hospitals after the shaking stops. If you live on the coast, find out today whether your street sits inside the tsunami inundation zone, since that map is published and free. And learn the one rule that matters more than any alert system. On the Cascadia coast, If the shaking goes on for longer than a minute, that is your warning. Do not wait for a siren or a phone alert because the wave may arrive before either one does. Move inland, move uphill, and keep moving. And that is the entire Japanese lesson, translated into English and delivered to a coastline that has never had to learn it the hard way. Japan does not survive earthquakes because Japanese rock is friendlier. It survives them because 100 years of dying taught the country to build differently, warn earlier, and keep water in the closet. The Pacific Northwest has been handed the same information for free, in advance, courtesy of a fault that last spoke through a village clerk's brush in 1700. Here is what to watch over the coming days, because this story is not finished. The Kumamoto death toll is still provisional, and it will move, because search operations at the mall and in collapsed housing are ongoing, and because Japan counts disaster-related deaths that happen later in shelters and hospitals as part of the total. In 2016, those indirect deaths made up a large share of the final count, and with temperatures in the upper 30s Celsius and thousands of people still displaced, that risk is live right now. Watch the aftershock sequence. The agency's high alert window has passed, but the sequence itself has not settled, and in this exact fault system, in this exact prefecture, a delayed second rupture is not a theory. It is what happened here 10 years ago. Watch the Hyuganada Sea. Not because this morning's magnitude 5.2 means anything by itself, but because that is the corner of the Nankai Trough that triggered Japan's first megaquake advisory 2 years ago, and it is the one corner where a moderate quake gets evaluated by a standing expert panel rather than filed away. And watch what Japan does next with its building codes, because a mall that was rebuilt for resilience and reopened in June did not last through July, and that question is going to be asked loudly in Tokyo. If you want to follow all of it as it develops, subscribe and turn on the bell. The next few days in Kyushu will tell us whether this sequence is closing or opening, and I will bring you the numbers as they land, without the doomsday music. The ground under Kumamoto has stopped moving for now. It has not stopped being watched.